this subject matter is so timely. As we've learned over the past 8 years or so, a lot of Americans don't understand the judicial system, don't understand the different branches of government or the Supreme Court and its purpose. So talk to me a little bit about what was your inspiration for bringing this subject for your next project.
It's great to speak with you again. And once again, you hit the nail exactly on the head. My background is I'm a lawyer, and I was just watching with increasing concern about what was happening with the Supreme Court. Folks were focused on it around the abortion cases, but there and which are incredibly important. And I've made a film about abortion access and particularly how that influences and impacts Black women in particular. But there's so many other things that, of course, the court is involved in that affect our rights. And when I say our, I mean all Americans. But of course, white America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. And so, when we look at some of the decisions that are coming down that are influencing our communities, if you, of course, take affirmative action, that's a huge decision. But beyond that, regulating the environment, Black folks are at the front of the environmental justice movement because we see that pollution happens more often in Black and Brown communities. We see that healthcare deserts happen more importantly. So the Supreme Court regulating what agencies can do to protect our health and safety affects some people even more than others. And I wanted to make sure that we are focused on that, as communities and saying, all of this impacts me. It's not just affirmative action. It's not just abortion. All of these decisions impact, all of us really significantly.
So, having said that, and touching on the fact that you are a lawyer, what about the American judicial process did you learn through creating this project and putting the different elements together?
I think like a lot of people, I assumed that there, number one, were ethical standards in place for the Supreme Court. And it turns out it's the only federal judicial body with no code of ethics. We were just saying, okay, we trust you all. I mean, and we've seen how terribly that's gone, from Clarence Thomas taking many millions of dollars in free gifts and trips, and even having his mother's home owned by a multi-billionaire, to seeing like, other ethical issues coming through for other members of the court. So there's ethics issues. That was a huge thing. The other thing is, that I always assumed that every Supreme Court justice had a confirmation hearing. And that's also not the case. Earl Warren, who is the Supreme Court justice who, decided Brown v. Board, or like led the court to decide that influential decision, had no confirmation hearing. That is not a requirement. That is a relatively modern invention. And so that led me to question, well, what else is just practice rather than required? And so I thought other people would be interested in some of those things too. Another thing that's really interesting is you don't even have to be a practicing lawyer to get appointed to the Supreme Court. Earl Warren was governor of California. Lewis Powell was not, so there were many things that I think we take for granted, but all of it leads to we need to pay attention. And so that's really kind of what I hope the series does for folks.
Absolutely. So I learned a great deal and was reminded of things that I had forgotten that connect the dots. So, at what point do you think, sort of starting from Earl Warren, that the Supreme Court positions began being used as a political sort of pawn, or to move around the board, to move pieces legally and politically?
I think the Supreme Court, by definition, is probably a political entity. The members are appointed by the president in power. They are confirmed by the Senate. You have to get out of committee. When we think of Thurgood Marshall's appointment, Lyndon Johnson had to first move somebody out of the way, and you could talk about the propriety of that. And then what he had done is he made Thurgood Marshall Solicitor General. So Thurgood Marshall, a Black man, was the lawyer for the United States. And so Johnson knew that that would make Thurgood Marshall the winningest lawyer in American history. And so they couldn't, object to him on his qualifications. So, but I think that while the process of confirmation is political, what we've seen in recent years is the decisions feel more political. Um, I think that's another misunderstanding about the court, that the justices are, they're plucking down the right decision from on high. Moses and the tablets, that there's one way to decide these cases. And that's not the case. The Constitution is open to interpretation, and that's fine. But what happens is when you're taking cases and not obeying precedent, when you're taking cases and not writing opinions, when you're taking cases in a way that you've never taken them before, all of those things together are cause for us to pay attention and maybe even to worry.
Absolutely. Speaking of Lyndon Johnson, I love the inclusion of the phone calls, especially the phone call with Marshall, where he says to him, there are two reasons. One, because I don't want anyone to ever be able to question, you leading. But he very blatantly says, because you're Black, because you're a Negro. And, fast forward to where we are now, that would be seen as very controversial, as almost racist in doing that. But then it was forward thinking and siding with us. So can you talk a little bit about the switch in directly addressing racial issues and positioning people as to where we are now, where it's happening, but it's sort of in the background and we avoid the discussion around it?
I think that is such an important question, because I think that you can say a lot of things about Johnson. He certainly was not a perfect person, but one thing he was very clear. And when I think about progress for Black people, if you tell us what the rules of the game are, then we can compete. If you don't tell people what they're actually up against, how are they possibly to make their way? And so I think what Johnson was telegraphing, which Marshall knew very well, was the only way that we're going to get you nominated and confirmed. Remember, Marshall had a hard time, President Kennedy had a hard time getting Marshall to his first confirmation. He languished for years without being formally, appointed. So Johnson was a realist and a pragmatist. And I think maybe if people were a little bit more open with each other in public, we could actually really start to excavate some of the racism that impedes progress. And I think that that's what Johnson did there.
There was, and forgive me, I don't remember who said it, that said that setting precedents with the Supreme Court is something that we won't really know the full effects of it until many years later. So right now we are dealing with some historic reversals and things of that nature. In your opinion, in looking back through this process, do you think that there is a way judicially that we can come back from some of these current decisions? And how long do you think that process would take?
That's a really important question.
I just
I
want
think
to Dawn.
no, you're just you really get I gotta say, like, I really appreciate how closely you watched, because you asked that question, and it just shows like really paying attention, and that really is important to me and makes me feel really, really good about this, because the series is aimed at non-lawyers. I don't know if you're a lawyer or not.
Definitely
Um,
not a lawyer.
I assume you're not.
Definitely not.
So I think what we're seeing, which is very interesting, is the Supreme Court is paying attention. John Roberts, who is the current chief of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice, does not like that there's so much attention and negative polling and feelings about the court. And so we see the court kind of pulling back from some of their more aggressive decisions. So recently, we had a voting rights case where Justice John Roberts, who said racism is over, and so we don't no longer need the Voting Rights Act, where John Roberts sides with the more liberal justices in assuring voting rights protections. So I think the answer is you can't know for sure, but what we do know is that the current path, the justices are worried about losing the respect of people. And I think there's going to be a lot of interesting conversations in the time to come. There also is a lot of pressure on President Biden and on, the Congress to say, if we feel like the court is not behaving in a responsible way, if we feel like we're worried about the rule of law, do we actually start to make some judicial improvements? Do we get a code of ethics? And you saw recently, Clarence Thomas and Alito amended their disclosures. That didn't come from nowhere. That came from reporting and from pressure. And so keeping up the reporting, keeping up the just the sense of we are watching and we want this court to be what it should be. So I think I'm heartened by that. Progress can be slow, but as all of our civil rights leaders and heroes will tell us, you keep your eye on the prize.